Morning all. I thought it'd be interesting to carry on looking at Curacao 1962, a really strong tournament where each player played each other 4 times. Now Mikhail Tal played against Fischer in round 4. Let's have a look at this game. So Mikhail Tal, the magician from Riga, e4, and Fischer played the Sicilian defence. I think this game is very instructive in many ways. We get the open Sicilian. Fischer plays his favourite Najdorf. And one thing about this next move, bishop e2, many players with white might be experiencing a lot of pressure later on the c file. So the question is how to address this pressure and how to address, for example, a knight coming to c4. A knight coming to c4 is putting pressure on b2, so white has to counteract this c4 strategy. And it's often the d5 strategy which balances things, and as part of that sometimes there's a bishop on e6 guarding d5, so sometimes white will play for f4, f5, but what is the role of this bishop and the knights later and this bishop? Let's have a look at this game and the mechanics of it in respect to these ideas that white wants to try and emphasize d5 later, especially if black plays e5, weakening d5 later, to have the Boleslavsky hole. And we see that immediately here after bishop e2. We see the move e5. So the knight goes back to b3 and now bishop e6. So black for the moment is covering that d5 hole and has the long-term plan to try and exploit this c file to try and get a knight there later. And can white actually try and prevent this knight maneuver as well with something like a4, a5? Let's see, after castles, knight bd7 is played. And white now plays a4, which ordinarily you might think well just is designed against b5, but also it does feature a5 to stop knight b6, to try and get maybe access to this c4 square like that, because it would really tie down this bishop. Unless white wants to give up, though, this is always an option, the white bishop here to give up itself for the knight here. So we see bishop e7. But now white's d5 strategy is emphasized now. White plays f4, so Mikhail Tal plays f4 here. And the bishop wants to have c4 available, so queen c7, so that bishop c4 is available to f5. We see bishop e3. And now, of course, there's an option with bishop e3 of course, taking on b6 if knight b6. But even more subtle, let's have a quick look at this. The mechanics of this. If black plays knight b6 immediately in this position, which wasn't played, white actually has here sort of, well, bishop takes b6 doesn't really do anything, it's check, and this is not good actually, this is not good for white. Black has nice pressure. The way to play this is actually to play f5 here, and say knight c4, white can actually afford bishop c1, because that bishop is having to go back. It's lost the c4 square. It goes back, and white should be okay. White could even consider queen d3 or even just taking this and going for that d5 square with bishop g5, trying to exchange off f6, and this should be okay for white. So that's the way things are balanced at the moment. So anyway, let's go back. So after bishop e3, knight b6 wasn't played. I think f5 is good enough. Black just castled here. And now we see a5 preventing knight b6 to c4. So Fischer, does he accept this potentially passive position? Does he really need this knight b6 to c4 idea? Well, you know, if he doesn't play his next move is trying to break out with b5. He accepts this pawn being slightly weakened, but he plays b5 in the game. You know, let's say rook ac8. What is white's plan here? Well, white can proceed with f5 and maybe try and exert more pressure on c4 later. So say taking, let's have a look, rook a4, and this is a pleasant position for white with that control over d5 for the moment. So this is the kind of position where you'd expect some positional maneuvering. So like rook d1, put more pressure on d5 later. And maybe even knight c4, maybe even to b6, which would cover d5. That would really grip black's game. So black took the opportunity to break out here. Fischer broke out with b5. The downside is slightly weakening a6. White took that, knight takes b6. So tactically here, what's going on with the a6 pawn is that immune here. If rook takes a6, takes, black actually has a very good resource here, it seems, in knight g4. So white cannot take here because it will be check and losing the bishop on a6. This will be losing the bishop on a6 to be avoided. So knight g4 is a good resource, kicking this bishop or asking it to be defended. But I think black should be okay here. After e takes, what we see here is this bishop potentially being quite dangerous later. Black's compensation for the pawn is evident. Either knight a4 or knight c4, for example. Let's go with knight c4, and black's got the two bishops here, with this dark square bishop being quite powerful, and black's control over d5 is adequate here, but this dark square bishop is really great. Potentially on e5 it looks really good, but it's just generally quite dangerous, so that's absolutely okay for black. So Fischer must have calculated this when playing this b5 for knight takes b6 to give up the a6 pawn. But white now pursues the d5 strategy with f5 anyway, and here perhaps black can try a forceful way of breaking out. Fischer could have perhaps tried taking this one for the immediate d5. It does liberate this bishop. This seems to be okay. It sorts out a few issues. This pawn sack here might actually be okay to consider. But Fischer actually, he kept that bishop on e7 to be a problem bishop. This is one of the problems. If white secures d5, it emphasizes how bad this bishop on e7 can be, locked in by its own pawns. So that's one of the key ideas. It's not just to have a pretty knight, it's to make sure this bishop doesn't see the light of day, or like kept a prisoner in its own pawn chain. But we see bishop c4, not bishop b3, bishop c4. And now this is really, really interesting, because normally you wouldn't want to give up bishop for knight, but here the d5 strategy overrides things. White does play bishop takes b6. He wants to not only improve control of d5, but make sure knight's not coming to c4 later. So giving up the dark square bishop like this is a way of igniting and trying to intensify pressure on light squares. It's check, the king moves. Okay, so we have a position here roughly balanced now. White's control over d5 means that this bishop, is a problem piece potentially. We see bishop b5, and now white takes on b5, a takes. So Mikhail Tal now plays knight d5. So he's keeping a piece outpost on d5 here, whatever happens, because if rook takes a1, well, actually, knight takes e7 check here. So no rook takes a1. Okay, so knight takes d5 is played. Queen takes d5. So a nice control over d5. Is this knight potentially better than this bishop? This bishop doesn't seem to be that locked in here. Fischer plays rook a4 now. And this d4 square seems a bit sensitive, and the c file seems potentially for black to be able to play rook c8. So white in advance of that plays c3, and we see queen a6 from Fischer, which highlights that this diagonal might be useful. Rook a d1, rook c8. Now, actually black, Fischer, is actually better here. Despite this bishop looking slightly miserable, it's this knight hasn't got an ideal square on b3, and Mikhail Tal tries to reroute it with knight c1, but now comes this b4, which really damages white's pawn structure a little bit. It's kind of minority attack, the minority pawn here against the majority pawns, trying to induce a fracture. And you might think, well, okay, cannot white just take this pawn? What happens if taking this pawn? Rook takes b4 is actually quite strong. What are the threats? Rook c2, bishop g5. There's pressure here on e4, so this is potentially quite unpleasant. This position to give black basically all the pieces are potentially active here. And any knight d3, there's also a resource which is to be borne in mind, rook d4 is always a potential resource here. So with that pressure on d3 being really annoying, and potentially just winning e4 of queen b3. So this is very, very nice for black, that this rook is very, very active with cb. So white just plays an ingenious pawn sack. Mikhail Tal, recognizing that this knight can be really good on d5, plays an ingenious pawn sacrifice here. He plays knight d3 just in time. So he's sacrificing a pawn, potentially. So let's have a look. B takes c3 by Fischer. B takes. And you might think, okay, in this position, actually, why can't Fischer play rook takes c3? And this is actually a very, very good question here. Just rook takes c3. Maybe there was a concern about knight takes e5 in this position, but it turns out that this is actually very, very good for white. If knight takes e5, d takes, queen takes, black has bishop b4 here, which defends the c3 rook. So this was an opportunity for Fischer potentially to play rook takes c3, which does seem very, very tempting to play this. Instead, he played rook a5. Rook takes c3 does actually seem, with the threat of rook d4 here, because it's taken out that c3 pawn, to be very, very strong indeed. When I say very, very strong indeed, this might be an understatement, because in fact white seems to be, if knight takes e5 is ruled out, white seems to be completely lost. For example, if knight f2, rook d4, and where is the queen going? The queen hasn't got any squares, and the rook can't take here without losing with queen takes f1 mate. So there's actually no moves here in this position. If we rule out knight takes e5, there's hardly any moves. We can try f6, just g takes f6. If bishop takes f6, that's letting black, that's letting white off the hook, because knight takes e5 is okay here. Bishop takes e5, queen takes f7 winning. So knight takes e5 and the game continues, rook c7. But no, black has g takes f6, and again white has no moves now. This, for example, rook g1, rook d4, and white's losing material. The queen is kind of stranded. So it's a pretty hopeless, horrendous position, and could have been a great win for Fischer against Mikhail Tal, who had mauled him in the previous candidates of 58-4-0. So this would have been a remarkable victory, just taking this c3 pawn, but it needed calculation. Maybe there was trust here that crept in, that knight takes e5 was good. Okay, so maybe a slight missed opportunity. Rook a5 instead, just wanting only to get the pawn, and here it really justifies the idea of the pawn sacrifice, because now it changes the picture significantly for white to be a pawn down, but potentially getting this knight to a key strategic square. It seems just a little bit strange that this happened, but so on move 24, I just want to check some game scores here that this really happened. It really did happen. Let's just for an absolute sanity check. Knight takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop b4. I think the issue, the concern, perhaps, was this back row deflection, because the back row seems sensitive here. On rook d8 check, this doesn't matter, bishop f8, because the queen's on f1, so there's no queen takes c3, and there's a back row issue all the time. And on queen takes c3 to try and improve things, there's actually, instead of being mated on the back row, black plays first queen takes f1 check to get rid of rook d8. So I think this is the key point which must have been missed. And so this justifies this key point. Sorry to explore that a bit further, but I think it's absolutely necessary to explain that. Because in the game, after rook a5, this now is a pawn under much less comfortable circumstances. Because after queen b3, well, where else for the white queen? Where can the white queen go? There's no other places. The queen's kind of stranded there. Knight b4, just attacking the queen in return. This is perhaps the only option to consider. But this is okay for black. This is quite favourable for black. But in the game we see queen b3, rook a3. But unfortunately, after queen b1, this knight, which was really terrible before, can bounce via b4 to d5, and this happens after rook to a takes c3. Fischer's got a pawn, but knight b4. That's this monster knight on d5. But these are real properties being expressed of the Najdorf generally now, because with this knight on d5, often players with white think that the attack plays itself and it's well worth the pawn. This Bolzowski hole has been maximised in the exploitation of it with the huge knight. The bishop's bad, and potentially the attack plays itself with things like f6. Well, let's see. Queen a7, knight d5. The rook goes back. The knight is looking after white considerably, but can black actually be smashed up with the move f6? Let's try f6. What does it actually do? It doesn't actually do anything. This position would be okay, it seems, for black. Black's got adequate play here. Should be okay. It's not getting completely smashed. He can give up the queen if needed. It's okay to give up the queen there with queen takes f7. So there's no easy way of smashing black up with f6. I think that has to be borne in mind here. Okay, so we see in this position queen b3, bishop f8. So where is the bishop going from f8? Is this an ingenious idea? Well, it gets out of the firing line of the knight. h3, rook a6. So Fischer is playing against a monster knight on d5. Is he devoid of counterplay even though he's a pawn up? Rook b1, rook a3, queen b5. And now queen d4, attacking the e-pawn. The e-pawn is protected. And now rook g3, and it looks as though potentially there might be at some point a threat of rook takes g2 here. In fact, if white's a bit careless, rook takes g2 could happen. If f6, rook takes g2 should actually be okay, like this for example. Check. And there's actually a perpetual if nothing else, like this. So rook takes g2 has to be attended to as a threat. And white plays queen e2. Fischer plays queen d3. And we see queen h5, queen c2 threatening mate, queen e2 from Tal. And the queen's come off now. And how does Fischer play this with this potentially dead bishop on f8 against this monster knight on d5? If white doesn't have something really concrete to celebrate the knight on d5, then sometimes black has chances to do something about this, and he does something very directly here. This next move h5 signifies a dark square strategy. If he can start to suppress these dark squares and fix these pawns on light squares, this bishop can potentially come out later as well to help the fixing of the pawns on the light squares. It can all be part of a dark square strategy, but this knight needs to be removed at some point. We see rook a2, rook d3 now, with the clear intention that this rook is interested in giving up itself for the knight on d5. But when is important now. When should this exchange attack occur? Rook a7. The fixing of the pawns on the light squares continues with h4. You can imagine this bishop coming out later. It's going to help this bind on the dark squares. But in this position, if instead of h4, so say black had played rook takes d5 here, does this actually do anything? Or is it big trouble? If say g6, it could be just very, very big trouble here. White's rooks could reach the 7th rank here, or d6 is dropping off. So the timing is pretty important. This position could be quite unpleasant for black. So rook c6, and we've got a passed d pawn as well. So not quite at this point. It seems rook takes d5 is correct. Fischer plays h4, so he's keeping the tension for this exchange sacrifice. We see f6, g6. Now, was f6 actually a mistake? Well, it seems quite logical to squeeze black with f6. It seems a very useful pawn. And here we see the move king h2, and it's this position after king h2 with the king on a dark square. It means this idea is with check, so it's actually played now. In fact, rook takes d5. The f file, like in the variation we just saw, is protected by white's own pawn. That white's rooks cannot coordinate that easily on the f file with this pawn blocking f file action. So this exchange check doesn't actually help keep the balance. Bishop h6. We see rook e7 preparing to double rooks on f7. If white had played rook d7, check, and e4, so timing, this pawn doesn't have to be lost, so this exchange check is much better than the other variation. So okay, so that's why maybe rook e7 was chosen instead. Bishop g5, rook f1, check. White doesn't want to give back the exchange, he plays king g1, and now g5, and here it's revealed something very interesting about the position, that the king has potentially got the g6 square if only the rook wasn't taking f7. See rook b1, e4, deflecting the rook from f7 for a moment. Very clever, otherwise black's going to play e3 with a very nice pawn. So the rook's deflected, and at this moment, without that pressure on f7, the king makes a run for it to g6. So king h7 to get to g6. So much more aggressive king now on g6. And it looks as though visually that black's pieces are all alive now. The bishop, which was dead before, is now active. The exchange sacrifice has worked. It's said that Mikhail Tal remarked that rook takes d5 was a very, very powerful move, like double exclamation mark move. So in this position, it looks as though the problems for black are over to a large extent. That monster knight is now just a pawn. And black is actually taking d5 to be now the exchange down for just one pawn. And here they're starting to believe that it's equal, the players, and giving up the notion that they can play for a win now. After rook e4 and move 58, they agreed a draw. So, okay, you might not think draws are that interesting to cover, but I think strategically there's a lot to learn from this particular game. When playing with white in this variation, I think great caution has to be taken to make sure you're not losing because of the c4 square in this variation of the setting. You're trying to basically get that d5 square. If we look just briefly back at the opening, you can see the key strategies later. And at the very moment black had a potentially winning resource, he didn't calculate properly. He could have played rook takes c3, winning a pawn under very comfortable circumstances. Instead, the d5 square, we saw the d5 square for this knight being magnificent there. And then the counter exchange that later, and black created equality again. So a very remarkable game for the strategy of the battle of the squares, the key strategic squares, and the exchange sacrifice of this game. I thought was very, very instructive and very, very well timed. comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.